Before we get started, a quick programming note. This episode of the podcast was recorded on March 19th, 2020. As I tape this, the global pandemic situation is still very fluid. In addition, in the U.S. at least, state and federal leaders are issuing statements on a daily basis. To help CSIA members stay up to date, the association has set up a forum on controlsys.org for members to share resources, advice, and tools to cope in this rapidly changing environment. To join the group, go to www.controlsys.org and type pandemic resources into the search bar. The link should be in the top 2 search results. And now, back to the regular program. Welcome to Talking Industrial Automation, a podcast where you get to know the people who make modern industrial automation possible. You will get to hear from CSIA system integrators and industry partners to get a better understanding of how they help their clients solve process challenges and how they've earned success in their careers. Along the way, we will touch on system integration best practices, technology, trends, and challenges. Whether you are a manufacturer, end user, supplier, or system integrator, you will enjoy the insights these industry professionals bring to this podcast. Let's get started. Hi, my name is Lisa Richter, the host of Talking Industrial Automation, a podcast where you get to know the people who make modern industrial automation and processing possible. In today's episode, we're doing something a little different because with the COVID-19 pandemic, things are a little different. In fact, for many folks, they are a lot different. To start to make sense of this new normal, at least as it relates to system integration and manufacturing, I'm calling on 3 experts, an insurance broker, CPA, and attorney, all who work with system integrators and manufacturers every day. With me today is Gloria Forbes. She is Executive Vice President with ECBM, a Philadelphia-based insurance broker and consulting firm. She is also head of the CSIA insurance program. Welcome, Gloria.
Pleasure to be here.
Also here is Tim Finnerty, a shareholder with Clayton & McCurvey, a global tax and accounting firm in Southfield, Michigan. Tim heads up the industrial automation sector. Tim, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
And finally, there is Lindsay Hogan, who is a partner at Fager Drinker, a law firm that provides transactional, litigation, and regulatory services with offices around the country. The firm also administers the CSIA legal program, which includes complimentary legal consultations to CSIA members. Hi, Lindsay.
Hi, everyone.
Before we address the more scripted questions we put together prior to recording the podcast, I'd like to address the specific questions we received from CSIA members. The first one comes from Kevin Mahoney with Casco Systems. He's wondering about the implications of requiring employees to work from home. For many organizations, work from home was optional. It was even kind of considered a perk. But now, if a company is requiring their employees to work from home, how does that change things? That is, are companies then responsible for ensuring an ergonomic, safe, and healthy home office for their staff? And what policies and practices do they need to implement? Lindsay, can you address this one for us, please?
Sure. And what a timely question, because just a few hours ago, New York's governor announced that only 25% of the workforce in New York would be permitted to go into work. That is 75% of every company's employee base would be required to work remotely. So it's a very timely question. And you're also right, this used to be a huge perk. And so a lot of the advice that we formally gave started off with things like make sure your IT systems can handle a remote workforce and make sure that you qualify which employees would be considered to be able to work from home. But in this environment, our advice is a little bit different. It is really good for employees and comforting for employers to clearly communicate what will be expected of their remote workforce. When are they going to be expected to log in and when are they going to be expected to log out? What times of day will they be required to be available? How are they going to be expected to communicate with their other coworkers and with the company's clients? In order to do that, we've seen in this environment kind of frequent communications from different employers, kind of suggesting how employees should communicate with each other now that they're working remotely. such as provide as much notice as possible when you're scheduling internal phone or video conferences. Because not only do we have a large portion of the workforce working remotely, we have a lot of family members now working in the home with your workforce. So I think I saw a joking headline earlier today that said Americans now have the worst coworkers ever. It's also reminders of things like be candid with your colleagues about your availability and understand that some of your colleagues might not be available during normal working hours because we now have other responsibilities to attend to as well. When you are sending an email communication that does need immediate attention, mark it urgent, because so much of our communications are going to be over email while we're working remotely. And just acknowledge the fact that things aren't necessarily going to work as smoothly as if they were not working remotely, but decide it's part of our new normal for now, and to keep things going. I've also seen some companies go out of their way in order to have kind of positive communications with the workforce right now, encouraging silly selfie contests, you and your furry friend or your children or your spouse, and just sharing photos across the company. Tips on working from home: in order to have an ergonomic workspace, the employer does not have a responsibility to make an employee's work from home workspace to be ergonomic, but it would benefit them and it would benefit the employee if the setup is ideal. So to the extent you can kind of suggest work from home suggestions, like put blocks under your desk if it's not the right height and things like that, it would be helpful. And along those same lines, even though the employer is not required to provide the employee with certain equipment to work remotely, from a practical perspective, if you don't give your employees the equipment they need in order to work remotely, you can't expect them to. So we've seen employers send out, even something as simple as like monkey surveys, whatever that's called, and you send it out and say, okay, employees, do you have internet? Do you have a phone? Do you have a computer at home that you can use? And then when you get that information back, you as the employer decide how you're going to allocate what resources you have to enable the workforce to do the best they can from home. So those are some initial thoughts on kind of transitioning your workforce to be remote.
Gloria, what about additional insurance coverage or other issues related to home office use?
Basically the areas that tend to be impacted most in a work from home situation are going to be your property insurance and your workers' compensation, because when someone is working at their home office, then they're still considered, at work. We've had a lot of clients in the service sector migrating into this ability to work from home for long periods of time. We've gone through this drill, not necessarily with virus before or pandemic, but hurricanes or natural catastrophes, things that have prevented access to a physical office. Most businesses have a property policy. That property policy is going to have, in all likelihood, an extension for personal property of the firm that is at another location. And so if you were to make property of yours, computer equipment, things of that sort, available to your employees for them to work at their home facility, in all likelihood, your property policy would be responding to that. The only thing I would say is to check the limits, because often those aren't the things people focus on when they're buying their insurance coverage. And the other issue, as I said, on the workers' compensation, sometimes, particularly when you're near state lines, but if you have people that work at a client's office, their state of, where they live their state of domicile may not be the same as their state of employment. So I would just look at your workers' compensation policy. That cover page tells you the states that you're covered in, and it would be something to double check when you have people working remotely like this.
Staying on this theme of insurance, what happens if an employee gets COVID-19 because they were exposed at the office or a work-related location or event?
Well, we're seeing communications. Well, I'm sure everyone is seeing communications ad nauseum almost, but we're seeing a lot of communication from insurance companies related to what they expect to do with workers' compensation. Workers' compensation is state regulated, so the guidelines, the coverage is different from state to state. So, but there's a couple things that we can focus in on, and that is that, number one, if it's a disease that you contract, then you're going to have to prove that the disease, particularly because this exists in the general population, that you contracted that disease at the place of employment. Also, in some states, it becomes important to prove that it was something that arose in the course of your employment and that it is specific to your employment. And, if you think about a healthcare worker with coronavirus, them being exposed to it is obviously tied into what they do for a living. We just identify to all clients, report any workers' compensation claim immediately, and then the process begin.
What about employees who might be considered at risk, say because they have an underlying issue like asthma or they're immunocompromised? If an employer treats these at-risk employees, and I'm going to use air quotes there, if you're treating them differently than the rest of the staff, does that open up any cause for like a discrimination claim? And if so, would insurance cover that?
Absolutely, it can. People have employees that they know are either in a treatment capacity at the present time. They may look at people that were ill and, go to them and say, hey, I think that you should work remotely. You can suggest trying to force individuals, if you're only doing it, or to mandate only doing it with certain employees, can certainly bring actions for discrimination. The employment practices policies, if you have one, would cover those alleged discriminations. I expect that we will see that coming out of a lot of this. We had someone in our office that we know is ill and treating, and she declined to work from home. It is something. Walking through your best practices is always just being consistent when you're dealing with employment issues.
All right, so just one more insurance question as it relates to employees. Can a company face a lawsuit from customers or their employees because they were exposed to the disease?
I'm sure Lindsay would say you can get sued for anything.
I would.
So then the question becomes, are you negligent? But in this situation, I think what we might see is not so much alleging that the party caught corona from you, but were you negligent? Did you fail to prevent? Did you fail to protect? And something in that area could come up and would, in most cases, because I always caution people, every liability or property loss that takes place happens with its own unique circumstances. And it's those circumstances that you have to put against the contract to see if it's covered. But I would see those claims being covered under a general liability policy.
Are you one of the 78% of CSIA members who said they wanted cybersecurity training? Well, now you've got it. CSIA has partnered with ISA to bring you a series of online courses that will get you the skills and expertise that are in high demand. This series will be offered throughout 2020 and is designed to prepare you for Cybersecurity Fundamentalist Specialist and Risk Assessment Specialist exams to earn certificates 1 and 2 of 4 that ultimately leads to the Cybersecurity Expert Badge. Best of all, you can access the material anywhere and anytime. To find out more, visit www.controlsys.org/cyber2020. Why not make this the year you earn your cybersecurity badges? I guarantee you won't regret it. Okay, Lindsay, over to you. Recently, the federal government announced proposed legislation related to COVID-19. Can you explain what it is and what that might mean for employers?
Sure. There's been a lot of talk about and a lot of government activity about proposed legislation and different things that the government wants to do to help employers, help employees, and also keep our economy running. One piece of legislation that we are getting a lot of questions about is the Familiesfirst Coronavirus Response Act that was actually signed by the president last night. It pertains to private employers with fewer than 500 employees and also some governmental employers. And the reason why it's pertaining to what may be considered a smaller employer with less than 500 employees is that there's a tax credit that goes along with it. So the government is recognizing that providing these additional leave provisions to certain employees is going to be a burden on employers, and the government is going to provide a tax credit to assist with that burden. This legislation, as you know, was put through very, very quickly. And as a result of that, there are some ambiguities in there that, I mean, frankly, lawyers around the country are kind of shaking our heads as to, well, what exactly did they mean by that? And we are hopeful that when the regulations are announced, sometime between today and 15 days from now, there will be clearer application of what these two different leave provisions are and how they're meant to be applied. But generally, I can tell you that this legislation has two different leave components. It has up to 80 hours of sick leave available for immediate use, regardless of the length of time that the employee has been employed. And that is to be used, or the employee is considered eligible when the employee is experiencing symptoms of COVID-19 and is seeking a medical diagnosis. So that would mean today I can check all those boxes off at home, and I think that I might have this, and I'm waiting to get into a medical provider and also waiting to get confirmation of my test. It also applies to employees who are subject to a government quarantine or have been told by a healthcare provider that he or she should self-quarantine due to COVID-19. So that would address different localities that have ordered a quarantine, such as San Francisco, who is in shelter in place. And certainly there are areas around my home city of Chicago, Illinois, that have ordered a shelter in place. But there's also individuals who have been told by healthcare providers that the healthcare provider cannot verify with certainty whether the individual has COVID-19. And so they're recommending that the employee stay out of the workforce for 14 days. So that's what that element is meant to apply to. But this also applies for an individual that needs to care for a son or daughter, or if their school is closed due to COVID-19. The second part of this leave has to do with expanded FMLA leave. And what they mean by expanded is there's additional ways related to COVID-19 that an employee would be eligible for FMLA leave. And there is certain amounts of pay that correspond with this expanded leave. Finally, some other important points from this act is that employers must provide notice to employees about their rights under this act. They can't do that yet because the Department of Labor hasn't provided the notice, but as soon as they do, the employer needs to do so. This act is only in place until December 31 of this year, and the benefits are not meant to carry over. And that's because the hope is that we've gotten through this pandemic by then. And then within 15 days from now, the Secretary of Labor is supposed to issue those guidelines I mentioned to you, and that should clarify some open questions we have right now, such as are different portions of this leave overlapping with things that employers already provide, is in addition to the FMLA leave that's already available, things along those lines. Importantly, employers may not change their paid leave policies once the legislation is enacted to avoid being subject to paid sick time provisions. So that's meant to address, it's anticipated that employers will need to provide this additional sick time on top of sick time that's already provided. And so what the government doesn't want employers doing is taking away sick time now so that they're not providing any more than they would have been before this legislation was enacted.
Okay, circling back a little bit to this idea of quarantines, from a legal perspective, what restrictions do employers face in cities that are on lockdown or with curfews?
I can answer that one. So, and that's largely going to depend on where the employer is located. We're seeing different localities define who's under lockdown differently. So, different areas are saying different types of businesses are essential businesses, but a common theme throughout them is that any business that's in medical, pharmacy, grocery related, things along those lines are deemed essential businesses regardless of the city that they're in. So with that in mind, the different quarantine or lockdown that is in place will identify the penalties for violating that lockdown. But something that employers should expect to be a natural consequence are things such as revocation of a business license. That's certainly true for restaurants and bars. We expect there will also be civil fines of a certain kind that might go along with that. So certainly there are severe repercussions for violating any lockdown or curfew provision.
So going back a little bit on this testing idea, what happens if an employer suspects that an employee was exposed to COVID-19? Can they require that employee to get tested before returning to work? I mean, the tests are so scarce, and there are currently restrictions in place in terms of who qualifies for a test. So is it even possible for the employee?
Oh, Lisa, great questions there. And it certainly is, that exact scenario is posing a big problem for employers because they want to protect their workforce, and yet at the same time that the resources in order to give that go ahead aren't always readily available. So the EEOC actually yesterday released updated guidance about what employers can do in light of the current pandemic. So I emphasize that if we were not talking about a pandemic, none of what I'm about to tell you would apply. But it applies in this special scenario. In our current pandemic, employers may ask employees if they're experiencing symptoms of the virus, including fevers, chills, cough, shortness of breath, or sore throat. But any information that the employer obtains, they must keep in a separate confidential medical record file, which would be true at all times. Anytime an employer is collecting medical information from an employee, they must maintain that information separately. Employers may now take the temperature of employees en masse. And 3 days ago, I wouldn't have told you that because the guidance from the EEOC was still that you have to have an objective reason to take the temperature of an employee because doing so is an invasive medical test in violation of the ADA. But as of yesterday, they've given it the go-ahead in light of the acknowledged community spread of COVID-19 throughout the country. Employers, when they are ready to invite employee back to work, they absolutely can go ahead and ask for that certification from a doctor, clearing the employee to return to work. It's an open question whether that's going to be available. That shouldn't stop the employer from asking the employee to get the all clear, some type of medical verification that the employee is able and hopefully virus free in order to return to work. They just might not be able to get it. If that's the case, the employer needs to look at it on a case-by-case basis while still making sure that they're consistent in their approach, that any employees that present with the same characteristics upon returning to work are treated equally in how the employer asks them to verify that they're able. If the employer cannot get the type of verification that makes them feel comfortable that the employee is cleared to return to work, we would encourage the employer to consider having the employee remain at home for up to 14 days with pay.
The irony being, of course, if you weren't sick when you went in for the test and you're around all those sick people, you may be by the time you come out.
Right?
This actually just happened to my sister this week. She was out sick and they wouldn't let her back without a test. So she had to go to the hospital and get a test. Of course, they wouldn't give her the test, but they did test her for flu and it turned out she had the flu. But yeah, there's just all kinds of rocks and hard places around, right? Mm-hmm. Tim, did you want to say something?
No, okay. I'm all set.
So if a business does need to shut down temporarily, Lindsay, is it required to provide notices to employees or state agencies?
Well, like just about everything we're talking about today, it's in flux. But that's largely going to have to do with the length of time of the anticipated closure. The length of time is what could possibly trigger warn notifications. And that is going to also be different on a federal, state, and local level. But generally speaking, if an employer is thinking that it might need to do a closure for a length of time, it should go through a certain process in preparing to do that. And that includes identifying the decision maker who's going to order the closure and then documenting the decision-making process and reasons for that. At that point, we recommend that you loop in legal counsel frankly, a few important reasons. One of them being maintaining privilege over your decision-making process, but also because the different requirements for when you're going to need to give certain amount of notices, it's changing on a daily basis based on locality. Certain jurisdictions are waiving notice requirements and others are not. So it's tough for employers to stay up to date with what they need to do or don't need to do in light of what arguably is an unforeseen natural circumstance in COVID.
I've been working with associations for my whole career, and I can honestly say I have never experienced a group of business professionals so willing to share, collaborate, and support one another as the CSIA community. During these unprecedented times, having a group of peers to turn to is invaluable. Whether the current climate means your phone is ringing off the hook or you're chewing your nails to the quick, now is the time to invest in your company, yourself, and this unique community that has a culture of sharing baked into its DNA. You'll also have access to member benefits such as best practices, insurance and legal programs, marketing tools, professional development opportunities, and so much more. To find out how you can join and contribute to this one-of-a-kind organization, visit www.controlsys.org/member-services. Look, I know these are some crazy times, but the CSIA community is ready to be by your side. All you have to do is join us. So I'm going to switch now more towards like the business profit side of things. Kevin, the CSIA member I mentioned at the top of the show, was also wondering if he should be making any special arrangements to try and capture the added costs and expenses to the company from pandemic-related things. Tim, how would you answer that one?
Yes, Lisa. I think it is important to track it, not just because of looking at it from the pandemic-related expenses, but you want to make sure you're understanding what are the additional expenses that you had to outlay that's going to cause your bottom line to drop. And most of the time, I think right now there is no business interruption for this, but we're in different times. So potentially, if you're capturing this information correctly, there could be an opportunity down the road through some of the stimulus package that they're coming in could help with that. I also think tracking these expenses will help you better manage your business in the future. In fact, one of the best ratios to consider in this situation would be looking at days cash on hand, which is part of a pulse survey that the CSA members have access to, as it tells you how long you as a company can pay your fixed costs without collecting any money or paying out any money to your vendors. So it basically tells you how long you have to live without collecting anything.
Are there any expenses, we'll call it pandemic-related expenses, that somebody might not be aware of that they should be tracking? Like, I don't know, extra internet charges or, help us get an understanding of what kind of expenses we're talking about here that may not seem obvious.
Well, yeah, I guess the obvious ones would be lost revenue. Where you're paying your wages, but you're not collecting any revenue because you're not being able to bill. So most of the CSIA members, have look at utilization, and if your utilization is not where it's normally at, so if you normally utilize 80% of your workforce and now it's only down to 50%, right? There's going to be a large amount of loss. But I would agree, the internet expenses, I've talked to a couple members recently, and they are going to a whole work from home way. And because of that, there's some additional, fixed costs there of potentially buying new computers for everyone because everyone didn't have laptops. Those types of costs, I would be tracking and really trying to make sure that we realize what we're spending.
Sure. So kind of circling back to this idea that there might be some government-related stimulus or relief, what kinds of advice are you giving your clients? Like, should they be banking on that money, or, what do they need to do in the short term?
Well, I think in the short term, currently there's definitely been a lot of talk about what's out there. I sat on a webinar yesterday related to the what they're calling it now, a $1.3 trillion stimulus package. Of that 1.3, there's $300 billion that's related to just a deferral of tax payment. One of the things that the government is doing is they're moving the April 15th tax payment deadline of making the payments out to July 15th, as well as your first quarter estimated payment for federal. Now, states are doing something different. A lot of them are following the federal. Michigan, for example, is following the federal guidelines. In most cases, I would tell my clients to, hold on to that cash. I mean, don't go spending it on other stuff, but hold on to it to make sure that you are doing the right things and not allowing your business to go under because you made a large tax payment that following year, you're potentially not going to have that payment. So you got to weigh some of those things and make sure that you're definitely talking to your tax advisors on this.
Are there other ways that people could hold on to cash?
Right now, the banks are still in a really good position. If you are having some other costs that you need for setting people up to work at home, you may look at trying to get some sort of equipment line of credit or term loan. Another opportunity that I've been talking a little bit with some of the business owners is that right now, instead of paying yourself a wage, just shut that off. And if you need money, just take the money when you need it, because you'd be not having to pay payroll taxes at this time or other related taxes that are your wages. I think that's one thing. As I was listening a little bit earlier, I think one of the things too that kind of popped up is as we start looking at this, companies may want to start looking at potential job sharing. Can I reduce my employees a little bit so I'm not letting them go, but I'm also keeping them their wages to where they can still sustain, at least right now, and making that point of, look, if I'm, the business owner can't be taking still $1 million salary and then trying to cut the wages of his people. I think we're in a different time. We need to all kind of come together and kind of look at how can we help each other out, because we were in a great economic economy until this virus came. It's really difficult to just see all the different things that is happening here and how can we help each other and make this end up being much better in the future.
With so many people working from home, canceling in-person meetings and events, and spending more and more time online, it's more important than ever that your digital presence is top-notch and that you find creative ways to maximize your marketing resources and get in front of your customers. The Industrial Automation Exchange and the Talking Industrial Automation podcast are the perfect places to start. The Exchange offers upgrades, packages, and display opportunities to ensure your brand is top of mind during your customers' complicated, research-based buying journey. The Talking Industrial Automation podcast can also help because now you can place your 60-second spot into the podcast. It's super easy and a unique way to reach new audiences. To learn more about the packages and advertising opportunities or how to become a podcast sponsor, contact me, Lisa Richter, at industrydir@controlsys.org. Let's face it, it's a digital world out there, and you need to make sure your company doesn't get left behind. Let the Exchange and podcast go to work for you. So another CSIA member, Joe Martin of Martin Controls, he wrote in to ask about the possible implications from a drastic decrease in consumer spending. Any thoughts on that, Tim?
Yeah, I do have some thoughts on this for sure. A lot of this is my opinion on simply based on what I'm hearing in the marketplace. In the short term, this definitely is going to cause some major problems to the economy, especially if the virus sticks around longer than what we expect. Some people are saying it could be up to 12 to 24 months. I think that's hopefully not going to happen. But if, however, we can contain this virus by kind of shutting down the economy over the next few weeks, and I see it happening here and there. Each of the states or cities are taking quarantines and curfews and things like that. Then when it starts back up, I think we can, if we can get the economy shut down and then start it back up, I think we can curtail some of those potential losses. For example, we often talk about Europe and how they take 4 weeks off in August. And what if we did that, for the month of April on a global basis? If you think you could help reduce the risk of a major recession, especially if some personal government help immediately, we have some personal government help immediately, which they're saying is supposed to be coming in April and then potentially in May again, could keep the people that are out of work right now flush with money, and you still keep the carry outs and the grocery stores open and stuff. And hopefully that could help us get us back to full capacity quicker and potentially get this economy back to where it needs to be.
I read somewhere that if Bloomberg just gave everybody $1 million, we'd all be fine and he'd still have plenty of money. So I think that's the plan we should shoot for. Okay.
On that, I think one of the things, long term as well is usually when we come out of these things, we always learn from our mistakes. And I think this pandemic has already helped us identify some of our major mistakes in particular the supply chain, especially for many critical prescription drugs, which are being produced in China. We will need to look at this in more detail, but I'm sure there will be some movement back to U.S. production on some of that stuff as we move forward after COVID-19. Companies will start to look at their own supply chain and determine improvements. But I think that one of those ways is going to be through automation, continuing to automate plants and different things. So I do think that there's a huge opportunity in the long run for the CSIA community because of the automation space and what we have to think about, with our workers and everything like that.
All right, sticking with the ramifications of a downturn, what happens if a company suffers a loss from coronavirus? Will business interruption insurance cover those losses, Gloria?
Well, I'm gonna give kudos to Tim, who gave me a little bit of an introduction earlier by saying that in all likelihood, business interruption insurance isn't going to cover most of these claims. But I'm going to give a caveat at the end of this, and that is that things are changing every day. So a business interruption insurance is on your property policy. That's the policy that covers, if your building burns down or if there's a windstorm. So it's generally related to physical damage to your location from a covered loss. And that's always the big trigger. So the building, your personal property, has to have a loss that causes physical damage to your property and has to be from a covered cause of loss. So the physical damage piece is a big hurdle to overcome with a virus. On the other hand, as I would say, this isn't the insurance industry's first rodeo with virus and epidemic. And in 2006, the insurance industry started to put exclusion language in the policy that specifically excludes losses from bacteria and virus. So when you put those two things together, it's hard to see, where the majority of these claims would be covered under the business interruption insurance that the integrators are likely to have. When we look at it from that standpoint, though, one of the things that we see is that there has been litigation on this subject in the past, and many times the client, the policyholder, has prevailed. Some situations, the insurance company have prevailed, and that is if a virus is present on your physical property, is that considered damage? obviously those cases get determined throughout the country and in various venues. One party or the other has been successful. And again, also based on what the specific situations were in those events. Today, the New Jersey legislature has started down the path of mandating that insurance companies extend some parts of their business interruption coverage to respond to the business interruption loss on that all of their policyholders are having. I don't expect that that's going to be the only state that tries to do that. We saw a letter from Congress that went out to the major associations in the insurance industry, all of the insurance carriers, and requested that they amend the policies and just pay the losses. So, the question around something like that would be, I go back to when we had 9/11 and there was the act of terrorism. Is the insurance industry capable of withstanding the loss that might get transferred? Or is it just going to be a state-by-state basis? This will be a very, very fluid situation. It'll change over the next weeks. And, I would expect that there's loads of litigation that might end up coming out from the situation.
What about if the loss is a result from like a cancellation of contracts or supply chain disruption, inability to travel or delays? Any of those things covered?
The majority of those will also not be covered by standard insurance contracts. But again, depending on the specifics of the situation, we might find some coverage in policies, based on what those unique circumstances are. We always refer back to best practices in times like this, which is, when you have a disruption, documentation is very important. We always push clients, document the loss, identify what the trigger was, provide all the details that led up to the loss, track the timeline, track all the expenses that you have. There are cancellations or adjustments or returns. Make sure that, you've got those allocated to the contracts that you have. Force majeure is the phrase of the day. Today, with a lot of contracts, people are saying, I can't meet contract provisions because I'm being prevented. We just always point to people, keep track of everything that you're doing, and then we should be able to then assist the clients going through their loss and determine whether or not somewhere in that policy there might be something that would cover some of the extra expenses that they've had. I would also say this, and we were talking a little bit about this from the economic standpoint. Some of the downturn, is industry related. We have food manufacturing clients that are just running at ridiculous speeds right now, trying to meet the demand for the grocery stores that are being told to stay open. So in depending on the sector that you're servicing, you might actually see an uptick in revenue and not a downturn.
Yeah, those toilet paper makers are raking it in.
You want to be in Wisconsin right now, right?
Yeah, exactly. So is there other coverage that is available that might cover supply chain disruption, or is that a dumb question? There
are policies that cover supply chain disruption, but again, they usually relate to either some political risk or the traditional risk that we think about. It was a hurricane, it was an earthquake, there was a fire at that location, there were tornadoes in Nashville. Those are the things that normally the policies respond to. So a lot of policies have coverage for what we refer to as a contingent business interruption. So that if your supplier was down, you would, and it caused a loss to you, from a revenue standpoint or from an extra expense standpoint, you would have coverage. The problem becomes that the pandemic is not a covered cause of loss. It's not something that was anticipated in the insurance contracts when they were written.
If we do need to reduce expenses, Lindsay, from a legal perspective, what are an employer's options? Can they ask their employees to take a pay cut? Or what about temporary layoffs? I mean, Tim mentioned kind of this idea of job sharing. They could just plain shut down. Are they still required to pay their people?
Well, that is, of course, it's going to vary based on the specific circumstances, and no employer wants to be in this position. And I think Tim did have a great suggestion there with the job sharing. I think that employers are going to want to take a step back and figure out, is there something before total plant closure we can do? Can we do certain sections of the business? Can we reduce hours in certain places but still keep the plant running? Can we furlough certain employee groups or departments? But in all of those questions, the employer has to remember that they might have employment agreements or they might have collective bargaining agreements that they have to abide by. So they should check those first before they start figuring out how they might kind of transition their workforce. And they also have to remember that salaried or exempt employees must be off and not working for an entire week in order to deduct from their pay. Partial or day deductions are not permitted because that would eliminate their exempt status. For hourly employees, you have more flexibility there on what you can do because you'll just treat it as a schedule change. But with salaried employees, you've got to be more careful.
Any final advice, Lindsay, for our listeners?
Yes, and it won't surprise you, but my final advice would be to make sure that you connect with legal counsel as you're kind of navigating this workforce. It's important, or navigating this environment, because of how quickly everything is changing. It's different based on locality more than what we're used to working with. So working with people, not only that you have privilege with, but also who make it part of their daily job to stay on top of the updates, can be really beneficial in helping an employer navigate this unfortunate circumstance.
Gloria, what about you? Any final thoughts?
Well, yes, and it might be a little different than most of what we've covered today, but we're seeing a dramatic spike in phishing and impersonation emails as this is going on. I think it's a very opportunistic play at this point from, the criminal element that loves to play in the internet, capitalizing on the fact that everyone is stressed and trying to get things done. And while most of the clients in our CSIA program have cyber insurance, having to deal with something like that is the last thing anyone needs. So I would again remind employees, don't click.
That's solid advice right there, Gloria. It's worth the whole podcast to hear that. So Tim, you get the last word. What are your final thoughts?
Yeah, I got a few final thoughts. One of the things that Gloria said that just clicked with me a little bit, especially in this CSIA environment, is she mentioned that food manufacturing is going through the roof, and the question is whether or not they got enough automated systems and different things to be able to keep this up. And I don't know if there's ways for some of the CISA member firms that might be doing some of this work that might be overwhelmed to utilize some of the other people that may not be as busy because of this downturn. And so, trying to use the community to come together and work as a group rather than individually. So I think that could be a huge opportunity. As well as I think you just got to look at and make sure that you're maximizing your cash flow and what can you do to keep cash. And probably the biggest thing for our CSIA members, when you look at it, is taking advantage of the research and development tax credits that are out there. And if people aren't doing that didn't do it for 2019, it's still available, and it could reduce ultimately what they would pay for their taxes, in April, now moving out to July. Those would be a couple last things of what to do.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Talking Industrial Automation. If you are interested in learning more about CSIA's legal plan and insurance program, go to www.controlsys.org. If you are interested in learning more about Tim and Clayton and McCurvey, you can find them on the Industrial Automation Exchange at www.csiaexchange.com. Thanks for listening, and thank you, Gloria, Tim, and Lindsay, for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe in iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also help others find us by leaving a 5-star review and sharing your favorite episodes with colleagues. Thanks for listening to the Talking Industrial Automation podcast. Thanks also to bensound.com and Wistia for the music bumpers. Until next time.